And yet he's very important for David because David is the one we've been looking at. He's been the one we're looking at his rise into greatness from a mere shepherd boy to a great king that God would eternally bless his family forever. And yet, David also was a man of grace. And as we study Mephibosheth, and it's hard hard name to say. In fact, you've got to be careful you don't say it and come out with something you don't want to come out of your mouth. It's about grace. A study in grace of David towards an enemy, an antagonist, and yet is some grace that as he received that grace, we realize we receive grace too from God our Father. There's also a study in disgrace we'll look at in just a minute too, because this story is not ending here. He goes on with some things that we're not sure. It gives us real puzzlement as far as Mephibosheth's life altogether. But in this we focus upon the grace of God in this individual. Saul and Jordan, by the way, in the context here, have both been killed on Mount Gilboa in Jezreel, this battle with the Philistines. And Saul was mortally wounded, and he asked his armor bearer, please put him to death. And his armor bearer said, no, I can't do that. So Saul fell on his sword. Jonathan had already been killed by the archers in that battle. So the family of Saul was in great disarray back in Jerusalem, or actually wherever they were, the cities near there. Wasn't Jerusalem at that time, but his family was in disarray. They all began to flee because they thought those Philistines, as they were sweeping through, taking this army, they would then come to the capital city and take the king and his family. So the family fled for fear of their lives. And his 5-year-old son, Jonathan's 5-year-old son, not Saul's, it would be Saul's grandson, Mephibosheth, only 5 years old, was snatched away to safety because here's the king's lineage. This is the heir to the throne. We got to protect him. So the nurse grabbed him, ran off with him, and in her haste she dropped him. And he broke his feet somehow, crippling both of his legs. 17 years later, we come to chapter 9. And we find out about Mephibosheth, this broken leg, lame man, about 21 years old at this point. And David simply says, who is still in Saul's house? Because all the others have died. Jonathan has died. David has died. Many of these others have died. Ishbosheth, another son, had died. Who can we honor? Who can we take care of? And that's where we come to in this chapter. So follow along with me, if you would. Begin in verse 1 of 2 Samuel chapter 9. And David said, is there yet any that is left in the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And there was of the house of Saul a servant whose name was Ziba. And when he called him unto David, the king said unto him, art thou Ziba? And he said, thy servant is he. And the king said, is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show kindness of God to him? And Ziba said unto the king, Jonathan hath yet a son, which is lame on his feet. And the king said unto him, where is he? And Ziba said unto the king, behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. In other words, the other side of the Jordan River. He's hiding over there. He's been hiding for 17 years because he was the heir to Saul's throne, but Saul's no longer king. Now, reading on here. Then King David said, and fetched him out of the house of Machir, and the son of Ammiel from Lo-debar. Now when Mephibosheth, this is his name, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, was come unto David, he fell on his face and did reverence. And David said, Mephibosheth? And he answered, behold, thy servant. David said unto him, fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness for Jonathan thy father's sake, and will restore thee all the land of Saul thy father, and thou shalt eat bread at my table continually. And he, that is Mephibosheth, bowed himself and said, what is thy servant, that thou shouldst look upon such a dead dog as I? We'll stop the reading right there, although the full 13 verses of the chapter we'll look at in just a second. But as we look at this account, David simply said, who can I show kindness to in Saul's house? I made a compact with Jonathan, my good friend, who was Saul's son, years ago, before his death, that I would treat kindly any family members of the house of Saul when I become a king. Because Jonathan knew David was going to be the next king. God had already told David that. Jonathan was aware of it. Jonathan wasn't jealous, wasn't seeking to be the king. he knew that David would be. He said, just simply be kind to my family if you would. And it said, some of Saul's family here flees in terror after his death. Others in that family, I mentioned Ishbosheth, his name was also mentioned in the first chapter here, 2 Samuel. He tried to rise up and become the king. He was a son of Saul, so he thought, well, I should become king. I should be the heir to the throne. And so he began maneuvering people, Abner and others, to sort of stand in for him and let's win this and let's become the king. And Ishbosheth ultimately died, lost out in that foolish maneuvering because God had already told David and many others that David would be the next king. God had already made the power shift to David as the king of Israel, not to Saul and Saul's household. Remember, the prophet Samuel said, God's torn this kingdom out of your hands, Saul. All those things that Saul had done, God simply by ripping his plate through Samuel said, God has torn the kingdom of you. So from David's perspective in this story, and that's really how we're looking at this, because the grace comes through David. It's not anything of Mephibosheth's doing. It's all of David. First of all, there was peace in the realm. We see here in the previous chapter we looked at, that all the countries around him were at peace with Israel. David was at peace. He was a great king. In fact, he was going to become the ultimate eternal king, or his kingdom would become. So in that realm of Israel, there was the greatest time of peace. We call it the golden age of Israel. Secondly, David wondered if there was anyone else in Saul's house that he could show kindness to. In verse 1 here. Is there anyone there? So he called his counselors and others in his court and said, who's there? And who's still around in Saul's family that we can do something kind to? Now they thought, well, there's a servant named Ziba. Let's get him. And so they called him in, verse 2. And Ziba informed them, there is a son. There's a son. He's got lame feet, but he's still alive. His name's Mephibosheth, Jonathan's crippled son in verse 3 here. Now he's 21 years old, 17 years since he ran away with that nurse and got out of the city. He's living in Lo-Debar, which is the other side of the Jordan River. In other words, he was hiding. He's keeping himself safe. Because you can imagine any king, a former king's family would worry that they would be killed. That's not just in ancient days, that's more in recent times too, in the last centuries or so. When a king and his family were still living, they would attempt in other countries, you've heard these third world countries, they'd go after those children, they'd kill them, they just slaughter them. Because they don't want them ever coming back to become ruling again. And of course that's what kings would do, is to take care of any kind of threat to their throne. So they sent for Mephibosheth in verse 5, and he coming in verse 6 was terrified. You can imagine. Why is King David calling me in? He must want to kill me. Because I was Saul's son, or grandson. So I'm of that lineage. In fact, I'm the heir to Saul's throne if he were still king. Coming before David, he was terrified, figuring he would die right then and there. He fell down at David's feet in verse 6. And David in verse 7 simply said, no, I want to restore all of your grandfather's property to you, Mephibosheth. That's my desire. I want to honor you as his grandson because of the promise and the commitment I made to your father, Jonathan. And in fact, it goes on in verses 9 through 13, the end of the chapter here, where David makes Ziba, this servant that he found the information from, the caretaker of all this property. David says, Ziba, you're going to take care of the lands and the property that Saul used to have. You know, David could have said, I'm going to claim it for myself because I'm king now. No, he gave it to Mephibosheth. This is your property now. It came from Saul. It was his inheritance. It's yours. But Ziba, you're going to be the caretaker of all these lands and property. Is that a good thing? Oh, he thought it was pretty good, I guess. He said, to Mephibosheth, you're going to sit at my table. You're going to be in my courtyard, and you're going to stay right here in Jerusalem, in my kingdom, and you're going to eat at my table every day. Someone will have to roll you in because you can't walk. You've got crippled feet. But you're going to sit at my table every day. So here he is, Mephibosheth. His name, by the way, means exterminator or eliminator of shame. I don't know why it's named that. It's also another variation. His name was Meribal, which has the idea of idol breaker. But the word Bosheth means shame. And Saul's son is Ishbosheth, the one who tried to take the throne earlier. His name means man of shame. So shame has to do with his family, and shame because of his, maybe his physical condition, his broken legs, his inability to do anything other than what someone can give to him. But let's look at the character just a moment of Mephibosheth in these verses. He was, first of all, a castaway from the throne. Look at verse 3. He was crippled and lame, both his feet. Not only was he physically deformed and infirmed, and by the way, how'd that happen? Flip back, hold your hand here and turn back a few chapters to 2 Samuel 4 and verse 4. You'll see what happened. Jonathan, Saul's son, of course, had a son, lame in both his feet. He was 5 years old when the tidings came of Saul and Jonathan out of Jezreel. That was where they were killed in that battle. And his nurse took him up and fled. And it came to pass as she made haste to flee that he fell and became lame. And his name was Mephibosheth. Just a name mentioned, and it's like, well, he's a takes care of idols. He's a person who is of shame. But he's only 5 years old. And then we don't hear of him anymore. So he's physically just out of it. He's cast away, cast off. Nobody cares about him. But he was also royally cast off, because God had torn the kingdom from Saul and from Saul's house. Remember after Saul spared the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15:28? Listen to what it says. So Samuel said to him, "The Lord has torn thy kingdom from Israel from you today, and has given it to a neighbor of yours who is better than you." You know who that is? That's David. God told Saul way back by the prophet Samuel, he's taken that kingdom away from you, from your house, to give it to someone else. So he's royally cut off, physically cut off. Spiritually, we don't know. It's a big question mark about his spiritual condition. We don't know anything about Mephibosheth's walk with the Lord. But we do know this, that while Mephibosheth was a recipient of grace, we see no evidence of his being a dispenser of grace to others. It was always like, here, give to me. I'm sitting at the table. I'm getting all these benefits as a son of Saul, a grandson of Saul. I'm getting all this in, but not taking anything out. Not sharing anything with others. Spiritually, we don't know anything about him other than that fact. But David still wanted to do something kind to this man. He was a castaway. Secondly, he was a contemptible antagonist to the throne. Look at verse 8 of chapter 9. He bowed himself and said, "What is thy servant, that thou shouldst look upon such a dead dog as thou?" When you call yourself a dead dog, that means you're worthless. That means, why would you even consider doing such a kind thing to me? I'm an outcast from the royal line. I'm physically deformed. I can't do anything. I can't even walk. I'm just a dead dog. And the very time, in fact, chapter 4, verse 4 and following, right after the nurse saved him, it says that Ishbosheth was being murdered for trying to usurp the throne from David. But the thing about David, he didn't consider Mephibosheth a threat. He didn't think about him being a threat to him. He didn't care. He had God's anointing upon his life. God told him he was going to be the king. So why should he be threatened by someone who was a former king or from a former line of the kings? David was that kind of person. So he could show grace because he didn't have an intimidation attitude towards anybody. And so here is Mephibosheth. He's just received grace. He's just received all of his grandfather's lands back. He's just received a position, a placement in the kingdom with the seat, the very table of David to sit there and eat every day. In other words, provision for the rest of his life for David. So he's a recipient of grace. And that's all we can say about him. He's just, wow, he's powerfully been given all these blessings. But then we see a third thing about Mephibosheth, and that is a perplexing personality. In chapter 9 verses 10 and 11. Because we go from grace to disgrace. Look what it says here. The king called Ziba, Saul's servant, told unto him, I have given unto thy master's son all that pertained to Saul and to all his house, given all his property. Now therefore, and thy sons, Ziba had some sons, and thy servants, Ziba even had servants, he was a servant, but he had some others, shall till the land for him. Thou shalt bring in the fruits, that thy master's son may have food to eat. But Mephibosheth, thy master's son, shall eat bread always at my table. Now Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. It doesn't say it there, but something about Ziba makes you wonder, what's going to happen here? Because it ends with all this grace being poured out to Mephibosheth, and you've got this servant that's going to till and take care of the land. But you suddenly discover that things don't go quite right in the future. In fact, we have to skip way into the future, probably 16 years later. And Bible students and commentators for centuries have been confounded and confused about Mephibosheth. Was he a good man or was he a bad man? And they said that either Mephibosheth was either a fearfully abused young man who was being taken advantage of by Ziba, his servant, or with Ziba's help, he was a skillful con man, a schemer, a deceiver for power and wealth. Because you have to believe one or the other, because they told different stories. We're going to look at that in just a second. Saul's possessions and land was restored to Mephibosheth, his property. Ziba and his family were to be caretakers of it. Mephibosheth sat at the king's table for the next 16, 17 years, till he's about the age of 38 now. Here's a crippled man, having been at the king's table every day, being fed, being provided for. He probably got fat over those years, being so well cared for. Until one day, around 17 years later, David's son rebelled against him. His son's named Absalom. His son rebels, and he wants to attack David and try to take the throne. So David, the king, and his court flee from the city of Jerusalem because Absalom was going to kill him and take him. So for protection, they took him out, as they would do for most kings, even today. They'd have him flee the country, get out in a protected place. But Mephibosheth, the crippled boy, or young man now, he's 38, stays in Jerusalem. Now, there are two different accounts of why he did that. Turn first to chapter 16 of 2 Samuel, and verses 1 through 4. This is Ziba's account. This is why it's so confounding of why. Who's telling the truth here? When David was a little past the top of the hill, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him. A couple of asses saddled, upon them 200 loaves of bread and 100 bunches of raisins. He brought all this food. The king said to Ziba, in verse 2, What meanest thou by these? And Ziba said, The asses be for the king's household to ride on. In other words, I'm providing for you, O King David. And look at verse 3. The king said, Where is thy master's son? Where is Mephibosheth? Ziba said to the king, Behold, he abideth at Jerusalem. And this is his reason. For today shall the house of Israel restore me to the kingdom of my father. Ooh. Ziba saying Mephibosheth is back in Jerusalem because he's waiting for you to be beaten and killed, David, because then he's going to usurp that throne. He's hoping for the kingdom to be returned back to him. And he'll say, I'm now the king. That's what Ziba's saying. Well, David believed him. Look at the next verse, verse 4. The king said to Ziba, Behold, thine art all that pertaineth unto Mephibosheth. In other words, everything that I have given Mephibosheth, all that property that was Saul's, I'm turning it over to you, Ziba. I'm going to hand it to you as you are a more loyal and worthy person than that old sorry crippled man Mephibosheth. And you say, well, that's pretty nice of Ziba. Good old fellow. But was he telling the truth? A few more verses later, look over in chapter 19, verses 24 and following. A few days later, Mephibosheth arrives. And he tells David of a different story. Chapter 19 and verse 24. And Mephibosheth, the son of Saul, came down to meet the king, King David, and and had neither dressed his feet, nor trimmed his beard, nor washed his clothes from the day the king departed. In other words, when the king ran out and took out of Jerusalem, and Mephibosheth stayed, he didn't do any of those common things you do, as taking care of yourself. Now that's a sign of mourning when a person does that. That's what the custom is you don't shave, you don't trim your beard, you don't wash. It's a sign of mourning. It came to pass when he was come to Jerusalem to meet the king said, "Wherefore wentest not thou with me, Mephibosheth? Why did you come with me when I left Jerusalem? Why did you stay?" He says here. Mephibosheth says, I wanted to flee, but my physical limitations as a crippled person, and besides that, Ziba, my servant, deceived me. Look at verse 26. My servant deceived me. My servant said, "I will saddle me an ass, and that I may ride thereon and go to the king, because my servant is lame." In other words, Ziba said, "I'll go take care, I'll stand up for you. I'll look out for you. And he hath slandered thy servant and my lord the king. My lord the king is an angel of God. Do therefore what is good in thine eyes." In other words, Mephibosheth is saying, Ziba lied. He's deceived you before me. I was back in Jerusalem, but he's lying about me. Well, who does David believe? He believes Mephibosheth here. Because now he divides, in verse 29, he divides the land in half. Half to Ziba, half to Mephibosheth. The king said to him, "Why speakest thou more of thy matters? I have said, thou and Ziba divide the land." Okay, now which account do we believe? The Bible doesn't give us any more reference about that. Mephibosheth was waiting for David's ouster to reclaim the throne, according to Ziba. Or was Ziba's deceit to Mephibosheth that leave him in Jerusalem, and yet he was still loyal to David? Which is it? Was Ziba a crook, a con man? Or is Mephibosheth a con man? Before we answer that question, why would David reach out to Saul's family to start with? Why in the world would David choose to be gracious to this man, Mephibosheth? After all, it's been 17 years. You move on after a while. You just keep going. You don't think back about folks that you had quarrels and troubles with before. Why should he care? I believe there's several reasons. Number one, David's attitude towards King Saul. You remember always his attitude was, he's the Lord's anointed. He had every opportunity to destroy Saul because Saul was out to kill him. He had every opportunity, but every time he said, "No, I won't touch him. He's the Lord's anointed." Even his soldiers, his folks who followed him said, "Why would you kill him? Why don't you take care of him?" I can't touch him. He's God's property. David honored the office of the king, whether or not that king was worthy of it or not. Saul was the most mentally unstable king there was, and yet David still honored the office. Consequently, he owned the house of Saul. He says, "I'll honor that too." But also he had a promise. He had a covenant with Jonathan, Saul's son. In 1 Samuel 20, verses 14 and 15, it says, and by the way, this is Jonathan's request. Jonathan's saying this, "And you shall not only show me the kindness of the Lord while I still live, that I may not die, but you shall not cut off your kindness from my house forever. No, not when the Lord has cut off every one of the enemies of David from the face of the earth." In other words, when you're at peace, David, would you remember my house? And David agreed, and he made it a covenant. He fulfilled what was asked from his friend Jonathan. They were close. One was the king to be, one was the king that thought he would have been. And they were together. And they made that compact with each other. And David remembered that. David was a man of covenants. We talked about covenant last time. How God brought a covenant for David, an eternal covenant for him. And he made a promise, he kept it. And he did here. But finally, I think it has to do with God's grace in David's life. David's kindness, mercy, his grace was extended to someone who had no ability to return it or to repay it. 3 times in this text in chapter 9, the word kindness or mercy is repeated. This word hesed. Can you say it? You got to almost clear your throat when you say it. Hesed in Hebrew. It means grace. It's translated in the New Testament or at least in the Greek, which later became New Testament writings, as grace. God's grace. Chapter 1, or verse 1, it says, what kindness can I show? I'm trying to bring back a little word. He says, what kind of kindness can I show to Saul's house for Jonathan's sake? And verse 3, is there not yet any of the house of Saul that I may show the kindness of God? Verse 7, David said to him, fear not, for I will surely show thee kindness. There's that word, chesed. Grace. Mercy. It's the kind of thing that comes from God. Nothing in Mephibosheth could do to deserve David's kindness. Grace flowed out of David to Jonathan, to Mephibosheth, to Ziba. All were recipients of that kind of grace that David offered them. It was simply God's grace just being flowed out to someone else. So again, which account do we believe? We believe Ziba, and do we believe Mephibosheth? You know, it doesn't really matter because God doesn't reveal who we should believe. One of them, or even both of them, had a warped view about grace. Because Ziba was sitting here plotting, if it was him, he was plotting how he could benefit himself, taking advantage of the grace of David to do harm to his own master. Or if it was Mephibosheth, he had a warped view of grace because he sat at that table for 17 years plotting and thinking, well, how can I get this place back for me? Whichever it was, there was some distorted concept, a distorted view of what grace is all about. And grace is something given to you, and you don't deserve it. It's not deceptively acquired. You don't trick somebody into receiving God's grace. It's something God in His Spirit works in your life. And overall, God does not nullify David's grace to Mephibosheth just because of what he did or his actions. Just as God doesn't nullify His grace toward us. Now, either one of them were plotting, whether it was Ziba or Mephibosheth or both, they were plotting something. It just goes to show that God's grace is beyond even our sinful condition. And by the way, there's one final act of grace which tends to make me think it was Ziba who was at fault, but the Bible doesn't reveal it. In chapter 21, verse 7, as the Gibeonites demand blood revenge, Saul's family, Saul's rulership did great harm to the Gibeonites. And they demanded some of Saul's sons to be put to death. Because of that, David was king. He said, okay, I'll honor what your request is. But Mephibosheth is not going to be one who will be sacrificed to the Gibeonites. It says, but the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, because of the Lord's oath that was between them, between David and Jonathan, the son of Saul. Even in later years, there was that sense of grace. I'm not going to let you die. I'm taking care of you because of the oath, the promise, the covenant I made with your father, Jonathan. You're a beneficiary of that kind of grace. Well, what does this Old Testament reminder say to us about grace? Now, I realize it's Old Testament, but it sure parallels the grace that God provides for us. Why? Because we, every one of us, is permanently crippled